Hey there, Squirrel Army. How's it going? For today, we are discussing how power creep affects the casual format. You can join the Squirrel Army by subscribing. All right. Well, this has been happening for quite a while. I guess it's actually been happening since the dawn of Magic, in a sense as well. But it's certainly from the dawn of EDH. But again, I think it's tough, one of those things to say that, things like EDH Rec or Architect or these other sites that you can, or Scryfall or whatnot, when people find these combos that you can kind of do and some of these more powerful things that you can kind of do in the format, with some new card that gets released or whatever, it's one of those things about the format that the format does creep up in power, quite a bit with the printing of new cards, more powerful cards. Overall, the entire format or the entire landscape of, Magic has been power crept up. Yes, sometimes there is a less powerful set, but cards are still becoming more and more powerful now. I sort of discussed some of this sort of stuff before, saying that, we do need some amount of power creep because no one wants to play with a 5 mana vanilla, 3/3 with no other abilities or whatever. We need designs to move forward. We need some of these cards to start adding synergies for some strategies and whatnot, because again, without them, innovating and trying to do these things, some of the decks that are out there never really get support, or the right support, or in the right colors, or whatever, and giving those decks that just, are all right decks, but they just need more support. They need more tools. They need more things that work and do more consistency. Not just like purely broken things, but they're just trying to exist as decks. Things like Chair Tribal or whatever, like some of the more janky things that you've heard of, out there and about there, whatnot, those sorts of things. Yeah, sure. Like, I don't think anyone's going to care that Chair Tribal or whatever got power crept up and has got more powerful, but it certainly does impact the rest of the format when certain decks, or certain cards and certain things that are put out there for perhaps one strategy or another strategy fall into some of these much more powerful strategies, like things like Corvold and things like that, with like treasures and things like that. Just, giving them free moxes that also draw cards effectively, for playing the game effectively with what they're trying to do in that deck. So yeah, it's just one of those things that sometimes a printing will not just affect one deck, it will affect a whole chain of decks, because suddenly somebody realizes, well, this is really good for this commander, or this is really good for Tulane, which is already a really strong, deck for the most part, and that sort of thing. So again, it's just one of those things that you can kind of get the top-down view, I guess, of the most powerful decks just get more powerful, much like in real life where the rich just get more powerful and more money and whatnot. Also, those decks just get more and more powerful because they were already really, really powerful, but now they've just got even more powerful. Yes, some of the more perhaps janky strategies got a bit of a boost and whatnot. Like things like Dice Roll. Again, since they printed a whole bunch more Dice Roll cards, now you can play 5-color Dice Roll, or you can play, something, like that, or you can, play 5-color something else, like, yeah, whatever. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of strategies that get helped, but also sometimes those helping factors indirectly do power creep the rest of the format by helping something out that's already really powerful, in some ways indirectly. But also there's just a whole bunch of cards that get reprinted, and they, print, 30 sets every 5 minutes, or so it seems at least. So there's bound to be cards that are out there that just power creep the format without people really noticing. And it's just one of those things where, how do we sort of keep that power creep to a certain extent? How do we keep, people being able to play just generic, casual, good, fun Magic and that sort of thing? Again, when you sort of say back in the day when somebody rocked up to an LGS with their precon, how roughly strong it was, and whatnot. Nowadays, the average precon is probably, what they used to call a precon was probably like a, maybe a 4 or a 5 on like the power scale. But now it's almost like a 6 or maybe a 7, depending on the precon. You can get also weaker precons. You can still get your, 4s or 5s sometimes and whatnot straight out of the box. And some of the more cheap precons can certainly be lower on the power scale. And it does depend also what the deck's kind of doing and that sort of thing with its potential and what it can kind of do. But again, just the overall arcing essence of the format and whatnot is getting more and more powerful. So what is to be done about this sort of thing? What can we sort of do to, because we all want to play our decks and have our synergistic decks and for our decks to do stuff, and we want to have some more powerful decks, but we also don't just want to have, busted the most powerful decks that we can. We want a variety of decks, and we all want a variety of strategies. I think, as I said, my strategy is usually just turn stuff sideways and see what happens for the most part. Not legitimately just like that, but again, like that is mostly the strategy of just, I'm going to mostly be turning things sideways in the combat step and punching people with stuff, and people still do that in these days of, huge power creeps and things like that. But again, it's just one of those things. But again, it has become a thing that I said before. Like people say, oh, combat damage is irrelevant or whatever. You shouldn't worry about it unless it's Voltron or whatever. But even then, it's fairly irrelevant or whatnot. No, it's not. The people, again, those people are wrong that it's an irrelevant thing when they're going, cool, I'm dead to this combat damage deck, or whatever. Well, not so irrelevant now, is it? Or whatnot. And again, if it was so irrelevant, again, why'd you run board wipes then? You don't need board wipes if the combat damage is irrelevant. That's the only thing that stops the decks from being more relevant, is all the wraths that you pack. So if you didn't pack any of those wraths, well, obviously those decks would be more powerful, but again, since apparently that strategy is null and void, you might as well not run wraths. So, but yeah, it's just one of those things that some people sort of contradict themselves by saying, oh yeah, this strategy isn't really valid, but then we'll run, removal and stuff to counteract that kind of thing. Just, wait, if it wasn't relevant, why would you run removal or, interplay for it and whatnot? But anyway, that's a different subject sort of that I've already sort of covered a bit. But anyway, it's just one of those things about power creep that kind of influences some people's perspective of, what's kind of going to go down in a game. They kind of have this perspective of, well, we're playing, power, high power 7s or low power 8s or maybe even mid power 8 decks. So combat damage is going to be irrelevant for the most part. No, it's not. There's some decks that are in CDH that are combat damage decks, not a lot, I get, but still, it's just one of those things that it does exist. So again, you're not going to not see it sometimes. And again, there's a few Voltron decks that are out there that are pretty good as well. I don't, as say, a huge fan of it or whatever, but that's just me. But, I am a fan of the go wide, let's punch people stuff, and that's what I enjoy. But Not to say that that's the only thing that a lot of my decks do, but I do have a deck that is a sacrifice deck that pings people and whatnot, and does all that damage and whatnot. So I have expanded my sort of play to include life drain and pinging and that sort of stuff nowadays as well. Whereas I didn't used to. I used to think, no, I don't want to do that. It does get a little bit complicated, but I've been playing now for a while, so that's all right. It is, I'm getting used to playing a bit more of a complicated game, but that's power creep in it of itself. Like, I'm playing a more complicated deck and sort of gumming up the format with a more complicated and more powerful sort of deck. It can win based not on just combat damage. Yes, it can win based on combat damage kind of as well if you start overwhelming the board and things like that. Eventually, bringing back all your sack outlets and things like this. And again, even if you're not literally just winning just from the combat damage, you're certainly, chipping away at people because they choose to block and then will still take damage and things like that from all the pingers and things like that you happen to have and things like that are in that sort of strategy. So again, they've got to be strategic. They can't really block too much of the X, 1Xs or whatever or whatnot, those sorts of things. Because whatnot, because they'll just get pinged for one anyway, and they'll probably die, so they'll get pinged anyway. So yeah, you've got to make those strategic choices. But again, when you're saying strategically, how do we sort of figure that sort of side out of how do we slow down the power creep, and when is too much or whatever? When will my deck that's now is considered a 6 or whatever suddenly become a 8 or whatever? Or when will the CDH decks suddenly be considered or the CDH decks of today be considered weak and irrelevant? Again, when will those combos that basically win on turn 2, 3, 4, whatever, very early on in the game be considered, and even in 0 at sometimes, be considered too weak, because now that almost all the decks win turn 0 to 1 or whatever, and things like that. So again, it's one of those things that the power creep doesn't just affect the casual side of the format. It affects the CDH side of the format. And I don't know how, much those sorts of people have kind of realized, wait a minute, the CDH decks of today are way more powerful than what they were, 5-10 years ago. Like, you don't see a lot of these commanders that you used to see that were CDH sort of staples, because they're not good enough anymore in the current metagame. They've just been power crept out. So again, how long is it before those decks that are currently, dominating the CDH format, power crept out? It is good to see, that there is a fresh lot of commanders and a fresh lot of decks sometimes in the format that people like or find powerful or whatever else. But when you're saying, well, the metagame in Commander, which is meant to be casual, is just getting more and more competitive and more power crept, there is only so many things that you can kind of do as well, to an extent, in the format, because you've only got 99 slots and your Commander. So again, it does become like that. And again, some people have to kind of remind themselves, me playing my, Chrome Mox Diamond, Jeweled Lotus Petal, Mana Crypt, Mana Vault, those sorts of things, and whatnot out there. They're still the top of the metagame and whatnot, but how long is it till suddenly, like, even saying that now, like, the downside of it is, or there isn't a real downside in some of those, because, like, you're winning, like, you're trying to win as fast as possible, so you're just trying to get your mana set and your tutors off and your combos together and complete and ready to go, and that sort of thing. So you don't really care, about like maybe taking 3 damage on your upkeep or untapping your mana rock ever or whatever else it is, because again, you've gotten that mana, you've gotten that investment, you've got that tutor off or whatever it is. So now you don't really need to worry about the rest. You've tutored for your thing, and now you've got to find the right time for people to be tapped out, for people to have spent their counter spells or whatever. And again, you could, have lost some of that stuff to counter spells or whatever as well. So again, like, that's one of those things about that metagame, and how long before, again, the metagame has to, change in a sense. And change is good, but, like, where does it end? Like, and, we'll be in like another 50 years, like looking back at the times of, turn zero wins being, or almost turn zero wins being too slow. Like, we don't, like, for CDH people, maybe they want that. I don't know. Maybe there'll be another CDH or semi CDH like format, like where they've said, you know what, this is the power level that we want to be at, because like being at a higher power level is just too much. So we've all got to make those decisions in saying, well, this is the power level that I actually want to be at. Or is it that, you actually want to be at the most powerful power level that you can be at, no matter what, just because that's what you enjoy, that's cool, whatever, good for you, off you go, have fun with that, whatever. But again, for the whole format, and for each individual in that format, we've got to be kind of, wary of going, this deck, yes, I want this deck to be a little bit more strong, but this other deck, no, I'm just going to leave it. That deck's going to remain, a 6 or whatever you want to call it, a 5 now, perhaps, or even a 4 perhaps now, or whatever it is going to be now in a year or 2 times. I'm just going to leave that deck as it is, because it's, a fun, janky deck that I want to leave as it is, and it works pretty well. It's not the most powerful deck, but it's just fine, and I'll have fun with it. This other deck or whatever, again, I want to be fairly powerful. I don't, again, want it to be the most powerful, but I still want it to, be competitive with other people that I'm sort of playing all the time in my playgroup or at my LGS or whatever else it is. So, and again, it does depend on what you're kind of doing, and what colors you're in and all that kind of stuff, and what your potential kind of is, and what your direction kind of is, and all that kind of stuff. So there's only so many things that you can realistically do to bump up that power level, and to, get those things and whatnot going, and get your deck humming and buzzing and whatnot, and get it to the level at which, is that power level or whatnot, or whatever you're shooting for, or whatever power level the deck kind of entails. Because something like Krenko is a very powerful inherent deck, so you might as well inherently try to make it a powerful deck again as well, because it is inherently going to be looked at as a much more powerful deck for the most part, and can do some really powerful stuff. So you might as well look to do that anyway, because there's no real point in it being a janky or less powerful deck, because it's always going to be kind of seen as a more powerful deck, even though it's kind of fallen up a bit in the last few years, but you can still do it. So, but yeah, there are a lot of decks that are like that you just kind of go, well, that, Corvold deck is obviously going to be very strong, so you might as well just shoot for it to being really strong anyway. Or same with Tulane, some of these other things, you might as well shoot for it to be as strong as sort of possible for the most part. But again, at that point, you're saying, well, that's because of the reputation or whatnot that the commander or the deck kind of already has. So why try to fight against that? Why try to go against that if I want something a bit more casual, or a bit more, fun, or not just I'm going to win, within as quick as possible, and whatever. then that's where I think we've all got to be at. We've all got to be at going, you know what, that's fine. I've got this deck that is now a 7, and in 2 years' time it'll be a 4 or whatever or whatnot. And that's okay, because it's still fairly good. It's not jank. And again, you never really see very many jank decks or whatever, what you might call a 1 or a 0 or whatever out there. So it's just one of those things that you just don't see those decks because people just don't build them. I don't think there's enough interest in people going to build a deck that's inherently like bad or inherently, again, kind of doesn't really do anything, because you don't want to do nothing. If you want a deck that is inherently bad or whatever, you're probably going to have a deck that's inherently bad, so you're probably going to be disappointed by it for the most part, unless you're trying to do something really silly with it. So again, like maybe Silver Border deck or something. It's probably pretty bad. There's probably not very many synergies there or whatever, but it's probably not that low, honestly, still. So again, because the cards obviously all do something for the most part, but it's how you put it together and how it all works, sort of thing, that will reflect upon the format and reflect upon the continued existence of power creep in the format. So again, power creep affects the format in many ways, and again, it affects people's choices when they see this new, combo-tastic commander, and people go, "Oh, I want to build that because that's going to be really strong," but then realize, again, probably the 5th or 6th time or whatever it is since they've released another one of these combo-tastic commanders, that it's like, oh yeah, this has to be a really strong deck, and I really have to invest a lot of money into it, and it has to be at the CDH or nearly CDH tables when I do play, or I have to remind myself, oh yeah, this is a really strong deck, and I can't just whip it out when, some, 11, 12, 13-year-old kids walk into the store and, pull out their precons or whatever, because that's not a fair fight. It's not interesting for me. It's not interesting for them. And everyone goes away having a bad time and whatnot. So that's what it's all about. It's all about keeping those good times for everyone kind of together, because, we don't want the power creep to alienate people that come into the format. Again, we can have those areas and those places where we play the more powerful decks. I'm not talking about CDH or I'm not even talking about upgraded precons or anything, or probably anything above an upgraded precon. But again, those sorts of games that are much more powerful for the most part and that sort of thing, because, those games that are played with the, precon or less, times are available to us still, because we still have those decks, or we still have those kinds of decks that are still at that kind of power level. They're more synergistic perhaps, but they're not really very strong at doing kind of what they're doing. So, but yeah. So those are my thoughts. You guys can always let me know your thoughts. Write them down there in the comments below. Hope you've enjoyed this one. Hope you'll join me again in the next one.